The divorce papers were already signed when Jolene found out the building had her name on it. Not her married name. Her name. The one she had before she ever met Conrad Hale, before she moved into his family's house in Savannah, before she spent 11 years making herself smaller so everyone else in that house could feel larger. She didn't say anything when the papers were handed to her. She just set them on the kitchen counter, smoothed them flat with her palm, the way she used to smooth Conrad's collar before church, and walked out of the room. That was a Tuesday in March. By Friday, Conrad Hale's family had lost their hotel. Jolene Marsh Hale was 37 years old when her husband asked her to leave. 37, with 11 years of marriage behind her, and a real estate development firm she had quietly built from a single rental property into something that managed 14 commercial assets across 3 states. Conrad didn't know about the firm, or rather he knew she did something with properties, the way a person knows a neighbor has a dog without ever learning its name. He had never asked for details. Jolene had never offered them. That was, she would later understand, the shape of their entire marriage. Conrad Reginald Hale Jr., 42, was the second son of the Hale family and the heir apparent to the Aldermore, a boutique hotel on the waterfront in Savannah, Georgia, that his grandfather had built in 1961. The Aldermore wasn't large. It had 42 rooms, a restaurant on the ground floor called the Crest, and a reputation in the city that was older than most of its guests. Conrad managed the hotel the way he had inherited everything else, with absolute confidence and almost no competence. His mother was Dorothea Hale, 68, a woman who wore her family name like a second skin and considered the Aldermore not just a business but a monument. She had never liked Jolene, not because Jolene had done anything wrong, but because Jolene had come from Macon, which Dorothea considered a kind of character flaw. Jolene's people were not Savannah people. Her mother had worked in a school cafeteria. Her father had managed a tire shop. These were facts Dorothea had never stated aloud but had communicated consistently and clearly through 11 years of small gestures and smaller courtesies. The other woman was named Faye Covington, 35, a former event planner who had worked the Crest's restaurant for 2 seasons before becoming something else. Jolene had noticed the shift about 8 months before the divorce papers appeared, the way Conrad's phone went face down on the counter, the way he stopped asking about her day, which she initially mistook for distraction before she understood it was replacement. She didn't confront him. That wasn't Jolene's way. She had grown up watching her mother absorb things quietly, and she had inherited more of that than she intended to. But she was also her father's daughter, and her father had spent 40 years building something from nothing with his and never once let anyone take it from him. She started making arrangements. The trust had been set up 6 years into the marriage, drawn up by an attorney named Howard Finch in Atlanta, Georgia, who specialized in asset structures so clean they were almost invisible. It was not hidden. It was simply not discussed. The entity was called Marsh Capital Partners, named for Jolene's grandmother on her mother's side, a woman named Ruby Marsh, who had kept a money jar behind a loose brick in her kitchen and died with more savings than anyone in the family had expected. Jolene had named it that on purpose. Marsh Capital Partners held a controlling interest in a holding company called Westbridge Group. Westbridge had been quietly acquiring distressed commercial properties in coastal Georgia for 4 years. The Aldermore had not been on their list until it was. The hotel's financial problems were not a secret, exactly, but Conrad had managed to keep the worst of it from his mother by moving money in ways that created the appearance of stability. The roof of the East Wing had been leaking since the previous October. The HVAC system in the restaurant was held together by a service contract and stubbornness. The hotel had not turned a profit in 14 months. Conrad had borrowed against the property twice. The second time at a rate that made Howard Finch, when Jolene showed him the paperwork, exhale slowly through his nose. He put the building up as collateral, Howard said. I know, Jolene said. The terms on this are. I know what the terms are, she said, and closed the folder. She had found the loan documents not by snooping, but by being the kind of person who noticed. The filing had been made with the county clerk's office, public record, available to anyone who knew what to look for. Jolene had been looking for it for 3 months. When it appeared, she read it twice, then set it on her desk in the office. She kept in a building on MLK Boulevard in Savannah that Conrad had never visited. She was not angry exactly. She was the kind of sad that looks like calm from the outside. The divorce was served to her on a morning in late February, when the azaleas outside the kitchen window were beginning to bud but hadn't opened yet. Conrad presented it in person, which Jolene understood was meant as a kind of statement. He was dressed well. He had shaved. Faye Covington was not in the room, but her absence had the particular quality of a presence. Dorothea was there. She sat in the armchair near the fireplace in the formal sitting room, her hands folded, her expression composed, wearing a look of patient sorrow that had clearly been practiced. "This is not what anyone wanted," Dorothea said, meaning it was exactly what she had wanted. Conrad handed Jolene the envelope. He said the attorney had gone over everything, that the terms were fair, that he hoped they could handle this with maturity. He used the word maturity twice. Each time, Jolene thought of how her father used to say that people who talked about maturity in an argument were usually the ones behaving badly. She took the envelope. She did not cry, which Dorothea seemed to find faintly irritating. "You'll want to begin looking for a place," Dorothea added. "The house, of course, is a family property." Jolene looked at her mother-in-law for a moment. "Of course," she said. Then she left the room, went upstairs, and began to make calls. The Aldermore's financial situation deteriorated faster than Conrad had anticipated, partly because he had not anticipated it at all. The second loan had a balloon payment due in 90 days, and the operating revenue from the hotel was not going to cover it. He had been hoping for a summer rebound. The summer was still 4 months away. He reached out to several investors. Most took the meeting, looked at the numbers, and declined politely. One made an offer so low it felt like an insult. By the time April arrived, Conrad had begun to understand that the Aldermore might not survive the year. Westbridge Group's interest in the property came through a broker named Patrick Ames, who had worked with Jolene on 2 previous acquisitions and understood that the name on the letterhead was not the name making decisions. Patrick was professional, discreet, and knew how to frame an offer so it looked like a lifeline. The initial letter arrived at the Aldermore's offices on a Wednesday. Conrad read it twice, then he called his mother. "Someone wants to buy the hotel," he said. Dorothea's first response was no. Her second response, after Conrad walked her through the numbers on a Sunday afternoon in the sitting room where she had handed Jolene divorce papers 6 weeks earlier, was a silence that lasted almost 3 minutes. "Who are these people?" Dorothea asked. "Westbridge Group," Conrad said, "based out of Atlanta. They've done mixed-use development along the coast." "Good reputation?" Dorothea asked if they would keep the name. Conrad said he thought that could be negotiated. Dorothea asked if they would honor the restaurant's legacy. Conrad said he would make sure that was part of the terms. He arranged a meeting for the 3rd week of May. The conference room at the Aldermore was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the river. It had a long mahogany table that Conrad's grandfather had brought up from Charleston in 1974, and which Conrad had always been quietly proud of. Patrick Ames arrived first and introduced himself to the hotel's attorney. Conrad came in at 10:05 with Dorothea and a man named Garrett, who was the family's accountant and who had been trying for the last several months to explain to Conrad that the numbers did not work. They waited. At 10:15, the door opened. Jolene Marsh-Hale walked into the room, wearing a navy blazer over a white shirt, her hair pulled back, carrying a leather portfolio that she set at the head of the table without hesitation. Behind her came 2 people from Westbridge's acquisition team, a man named Douglas and a woman named Renata, who took seats on either side of her. Conrad did not move. Dorothea made a sound that was not quite a word. Jolene looked at them both the way a person looks at a room they have already measured. "Good morning," she said, and sat down. For several seconds, no one else spoke. Patrick Ames opened his folder. Douglas passed a copy of the acquisition summary to Garrett, who took it automatically. Renata poured water. "What is this?" Conrad said. It was not exactly a question. "Acquisition meeting," Jolene said. "We're here to finalize terms." "You," Conrad stopped. He looked at Patrick Ames, who was studying his documents with the focused attention of a man who had been paid to be present but not to react. "You with Westbridge?" "Marsh Capital Partners is the parent entity," Jolene said. "Westbridge is the development arm." She opened the portfolio. "You have the summary Patrick sent over. The terms are largely unchanged from the preliminary offer, except for the service and staffing provisions, which we've restructured slightly." Dorothea stood up. It was the kind of stand that was meant to change the temperature of a room. Dorothea had been doing it at dinner tables and board meetings and family holidays for 40 years, and it had always worked. "By what right?" Dorothea said. "Are you sitting at that table?" Jolene looked up from the portfolio. She held her mother-in-law's gaze for exactly the length of time it takes to make a decision. "Ownership," she said, and then she turned back to the documents. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Garrett signed the initial authorization. Conrad did not speak much after the first 20 minutes. Dorothea sat back down and remained in her chair, very still, with the expression of a person who has reached the end of an argument they didn't know they were having. The terms were not punitive. Jolene had not constructed this to wound, though it would wound anyway. Westbridge would acquire full ownership of the Aldermore and its grounds. The restaurant, the Crest, would remain open under new management. The Hale name would not appear anywhere in the rebranded property. The staff would be retained where performance merited retention. There was no provision that the Hale family continue to have access to the building. Conrad found this out when he reviewed the final documents that evening at home, in the house that still technically had 3 weeks left on the occupancy clause of the divorce agreement. He called his attorney. His attorney called Westbridge's counsel. Westbridge's counsel confirmed that the terms were standard and had been clearly outlined in the preliminary summary. The building was no longer his, the name above the door was no longer his family's. The mahogany table from Charleston, which he had always been quietly proud of, now belonged to the woman he had handed divorce papers to in February, while his mother watched from an armchair. Jolene stayed in Savannah. She kept the office on MLK Boulevard, hired 2 new associates in the fall, and expanded Marsh Capital's focus into hospitality development along the Georgia coast. The Aldermore was renovated that autumn. The east wing roof was replaced. The HVAC system was rebuilt from the ground up, and the crest was redesigned by a team out of Charleston who kept the bones of the original space while making it something the neighborhood actually wanted to visit. The hotel reopened under a new name in November. There was a small event local press covered it. Jolene attended. She stood near the window that overlooked the river and held a glass of sparkling water, and talked to the architect about a project at Brunswick, and people who saw her that evening later described her as relaxed, though not exactly happy, which is a different thing. She had not spoken to Conrad since the May meeting. She had not spoken to Dorothea at all. Faye Covington, she heard through a mutual acquaintance, had ended things with Conrad sometime in the summer, not long after the hotel sale was finalized. This information arrived in a text message Jolene read on a Wednesday and then set her phone face down on the counter, which is something she noticed herself doing, and almost smiled. She did not take Conrad back. That was never the question. The question people asked, quietly, in the way people ask questions they suspect they already know the answer to, was whether she had done this to hurt him. She had thought about how to answer this. She had arrived eventually at something honest. She had not bought the hotel to punish Conrad. She had bought it because it was a good acquisition at the right price, and because the financial structure made sense, and because Marsh Capital had been watching the Savannah waterfront for 3 years, and the Aldermore kept coming up as an underperforming asset in a premium location. That it happened to belong to her husband was a fact. That he had divorced her 6 weeks before the acquisition closed was also a fact. She had learned from her father, who had managed a tire shop in Macon for 4 decades without a single vacation and died with his mortgage paid and his name on the deed, that the facts of a situation were the only things that didn't change depending on who was telling the story. She kept his photograph on her desk at the office on MLK Boulevard. On the back, in her handwriting, was something he used to say to her when she was young and had been treated unfairly and didn't understand why people didn't seem to notice. They'll notice, he used to tell her, just not on your schedule. The building on the waterfront had her name on it now. Not her married name, her name, the one she had always had.